Hello, everybody. Welcome. We're just gonna get started in a few minutes. While we wait to get started, would anybody, want to say in the chat what they're excited the most about the seminar, or maybe something about physics they're passionate about? Feel free to type in the chat, or if you would like to unmute, that is fine as well.
Hi guys, my name is Sean Sukhjit, as you guys probably know, on the Clementis server. I'm currently a second year in a double major of math and physics with the Open University. I'm extremely excited about this seminar because it seems like something I would want to do in the near future. Any physics research is good research, but I'm thankful for this opportunity, and hopefully, let's see where we can go from here from the seminar.
That's great. Thank you for showing a camera and thank you for introducing yourself. We have wonderful speakers here today, and I hope you can gain something from this as well.
Yeah, much appreciated. It's it's so good that we're organizing more stuff like this, and hopefully we can really take something off the ground. I mean, again, this is an innovative approach, so um, having any opportunity is good opportunity.
That's great. And throughout the session, we really try to make to like demystify, physics research, because I know if you watch a lot of seminars, it could be like quite complex, though we would try to make it as simple as we can. And of course, if you have any questions, just feel free to ask after the seminar. Because some of these concepts I will be tackling would be quite challenging, but we try our best to make sure that you guys really enjoy what's going on in the world of physics. Okay, and so hello again, everybody. Welcome to our special session, Exploring the Frontiers of Physics, Research Stories from Dark Matter to Astronomy. There will be cover a little bit about biophysics as well. And today we would have graduate students who is going to share their personal journeys, insights, and advice on how to navigate the fascinating world of physics research. And it's my honor to invite and introduce our speakers, Libby and Duanil, for today's session. So, Libby, you want to say hello, Libby?
Hello, hi everybody. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, so Libby is currently embarking on a fully funded PhD program at the University of Sydney, and she's specializing in the creation of plasmonic waveguides. She's intrigued by the potential plasmonic waveguides to overcome the limits of past structures, enhancing light manipulation at nanoscale. She also received the Fulbright Pearson Scholarship at the University of Toronto, where she did her undergraduate in physics and astrophysics. So welcome, Libby, and thank you for joining us today. I also want to introduce another speaker. His name is Dwanil. He actually couldn't make it today, but Libby will be presenting his experience on behalf of him. So thanks to him for creating the wonderful slides and sharing his experience. So Dwanil is a master's student in astronomy at Leiden University, specializing in instrumentation. He's interested in exploring applications of photonics and metastructures in new age instruments for optical and infrared astronomy. He completed his undergraduate studies at the University of Toronto, also specializing in astronomy and physics. So now that I have introduced, I'm Sapo. I'm a PhD student um, at the University of Oxford. I did neuroscience in my undergrad, and I would be covering a little bit on how principles of physics have been applied in neuroscience. And now I would let Libby lead this entire session, and in between, I might jump in and talk about biophysics. So Libby, feel free to take on from here.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And well, I'll begin this presentation by asking you to look at this image and ask you, does anybody actually recognize what this is? If anybody wants to say it or type it in the chat, maybe?
That's the Mandelbrot set, I think.
Yeah, exactly. So this is, I think somebody typed something in the chat.
This is fractals.
Yes, exactly. These are what are known as fractals. And in very simple terms, fractals are created by repeating, by calculating an equation thousands and thousands of times. So as we're going to see in the video here, when you zoom into a fractal, you see this pattern repeat over and over and over again, pretty much infinitely. And well, what does this have to do with today's presentation? Well, I find that a good way of understanding how it is to dive into the world of research is by zooming into a fractal. And for this, I'll ask you to consider the following example. Oops. So let's say you have an interest in astronomy and you also find physics really interesting. So you're going to start learning both of them a bit over and over again, and then you decide to make a zoom in this region here and find yourself with the world of astrophysics. Now, let's say, okay, I like astrophysics, I find this pretty cool, I want to do research in this area. So you make another little zoom, and you find that astrophysics has an experimental side, theoretical side, and a bit of both kind of side. Now, let's say you're a bit more like me and you prefer more of the experimental and theoretical type of work, so you choose this area here and you make another zoom in. All of a sudden, you find yourself with this world of possibilities in which you can do research in. Now, most of you might be familiar with astrophysics research with regards to galaxy formation maybe, or star evolution, or those fancy pictures that you see that James telescopes has allowed us to visualize. But there's also other parts such as the detector and instrumentation work, specifically particle detectors. There's also work when it comes to dark matter research, simulations, and optical systems that have to be built even before you're actually able to put these telescopes together. Now, I'm telling you this just to give you an idea of how broad and how much you can dive into the world of research and end up finding all of these niche kind of groups. So with that mindset, we're going to dive into a few of our research stories. First, I'm going to be presenting a bit of the work I did regarding instrumentation. Then Dwanil was supposed to present a bit of photonics behind astronomy, but I'll be taking over that part. And finally, Sap was going to tell us about how he encountered physics in neuroscience. Then we're going to wrap everything up by giving a few of the skills we recommend specifically before going into research, so more technical level skills. And finally, we're kind of going to shine a bit of light into the reality of research, so more personal type tips. So as I just mentioned, I did a bit of work on instrumentation for particle physics, more specifically dark matter particle detectors. Now, for those of you not familiar with, dark matter particles are a theoretic type of particle that does not interact with light, meaning it does not absorb, reflect, or emit light, making it really hard to detect. So out of these detectors, I specifically collaborated with people to improve the electronic readout and feedback system. Now, all that this little piece of electronic does, it pretty much allows you to read out the signal and see it on your computer. Okay? But I'm sure that if you hear the word instrumentation, experimental, and stuff like that, you kind of visualize the sci-fi things when we see people soldering stuff, creating stuff, and going directly into the dirty kind of work. But I also had that idea. But when I dive into this, I first have to understand how to even attempt to detect dark matter. So here we have this really fun little model that's called the make it, shake it, break it model. And it pretty much highlights the three main methodologies of which we can detect dark matter. The first one, which is the make it one, is when we try to generate dark matter particles by colliding standard model particles. The shake it one, which is also known as the direct detection methodology, it focuses on identifying the scattering outcomes of dark matter particles. So what happens when a dark matter particle collides with a standard model particle. And finally, there's the break it one. So we try to indirectly identify dark matter by seeing what we theorize would come out of a dark matter pair annihilation. I specifically work with the shaken methodology, and for that we have specific type detectors. Here, in principle, how detectors work in this methodology is that you have a theoretical dark matter particle that is going to go collide with the blue thing that you see there, which is just a crystal, and it's going to collide with a nuclei of the particles of this crystal, and a bunch of things are going to be released, as you can see here. There's specific detectors for specific types of signals, but here we're going to focus on the vibrations. Now, in principle and to the most fundamental level, what's going to happen is that these vibrations are going to be caught up by a circuit, which is then going to send another signal to a signal detector. And finally, we have the readout system electronics, which is the piece that I was working on with other PhD students. Now, this thing that you see here is what we were able to create. What you see there was pretty much drafted from scratch. The board, all the pieces, everything was soldered by hand. And in general, the design was created as a collaboration. Now, as you can see, I thought when I went into this, I was going to jump directly into doing this kind of things. But as you can see, this was only the third step. I had to understand all the theory behind stuff and things that I did not realize I had to do in experimental work. Now, at the beginning, I said we improved this. And for anybody curious, I just wanted to share that we improved this by taking all the mechanical components. And with mechanical, I mean, you see there, here I can probably highlight you see these things here. These are manual switches. So if you wanted to change the switch, you had to open that box, and it should close, manually go, switch the switch, and if you want to change anything else, you had to manually do it. Whereas in the electronic one, the one that we created, everything is controlled through a computer. This allows us to get rid of background noise and unwanted noise that comes out from mechanical interruptions. And finally, just to kind of wrap up a bit of like the story of this work, we tested that the board actually works. And in principle, as I mentioned at the beginning, it is just a board that reads out a signal and allows you to pass it clearly. It has a bunch of other functions, but the simplest test you can do is pass a signal. For here, we have a simple sine wave, and we attempt to read it at another channel. And as you can see here, the magenta curve, we are able to read it clearly, and we even are able to amplify it by a bit. In general, with this little story, I just wanted to highlight how you might go into a specific research area expecting one thing, but realize that there's actually many other things. When for me, it was the theory work and the actual having to test at the end kind of work that took me by surprise, but allowed me to learn a bunch of other things.
Before you move forward, can you go to the previous slide and can you
Yep.
just explain what are the yellow lines and what are the pink lines and how you're proving that the electronic board actually improved the signal detection? You know what I mean?
Yeah, so the yellow line that you see there would be a very distorted signal that we had for reference. The signal, well, as I said, very distorted, and that's what you don't want. Now, the signal that we input is the light blue that you see here. That's the signal we generated, and we pass through one of the channels. So here, what we're doing is we're testing one of the channels of the board. This board, as you can see in this image here, has many channels. Each of them have a specific for us in order to test the signal at specific places on the board. And in this channel specifically, we want to amplify our signal. We want to read it and we want to amplify it, which is why you can see the magenta curve here actually being much larger than the initial light blue. So yeah.
So there's less noise in the pink one, right?
Yeah, compared to the yellow one, for example. Yeah.
Very cool.
It worked in principle. There's a bunch of tests that have to do afterwards, but in principle, it gladly did work. Yeah. Okay, so now moving on to Dwayne's part, he was supposed to tell you a bit about Astrophotonics, which is a combination of astronomy and photonics. And for those of you not familiar with, photonics refers to a sub-area of optics which deals with nano and microscale components. So instead of dealing with huge mirrors and beam splitters and stuff like that, we deal with like photonic chips and stuff that, for example, you have on your phone. But yeah, so I will take over this part as I shared a bit of the work that he did. And to begin his story, I'll ask you to look at this here, for example. Let's say we want to look at this tiny cluster of stars, right? And here I count 1, 2, 3, 4, right? If I just look at this image and be like, okay, I have 4 stars here, right? I don't see anything else. But look at this here. If we clear out the image, we can see that this one actually had a star that was very close to the other one. And we can actually see that there's many more stars than we actually initially expected there to be. So why am I telling you this? This is the work that's done by adaptive optics. Adaptive optics is going to allow us to go from this fuzzy image to this image here. And how does this work in principle? Well, here we have what adaptive optics does. Now, this is specifically designed for ground-based telescopes. So you have your ground-based telescope here, you have your star here that you want to observe, but there's atmospheric layers that are going to distort your light. So they're going to take it from being nice source of light to a very wiggly kind of distorted line, which leads you to the image you can see here. Now, adaptive optics in principle uses what is known as shape-shifting mirrors or deformable mirrors that are going to take the opposite shape of your distortion, okay, such that when this goes and bounces on our deformable mirror, it's going to be a nice undistorted source of light once again. So as you can see here, each one of these little things is what's called an actuator, and it's going to move accordingly what you tell it to do. Now, the problem with this is that deformable mirrors are really, really bulky. This is one, for example. And the problem with that is that the greater your distortion, the more of those little actuators you're actually going to need to make the corrections. Now, this gets very complex when it comes to cabling and electronic work. Each cable that you see there controls each one of the little actuators that we have, and things get very complex really fast. This is specifically where photonics and more specifically astrophotonics comes into play, because you can actually replace that huge mirror with this chip that's smaller than your fingernail. Now, here we have the chip, and in principle, what's going to happen is that you replace that huge mirror, you grab the chip, and the part of the chip here, which I'm more than happy to explain at the end of the presentation if anybody's curious of how this actually works, is pretty much a photonic deformable mirror. So with this, Daniel mainly wanted to highlight that astrophotonics is really important because it can allow us to reduce the size of our components, and it reduces the cost. Believe it or not, this little thing costs much less to produce than that huge mirror, and it also has a wider range of corrections. Finally, Daniel asked me to tell you that, in general, the main giveaway of the story that he was going to say is that this is a very niche group. Many times you hear about astronomy and telescopes, optics, and stuff like that, but adaptive optics, and more specifically photonic adaptive optics, is a very niche group that requires you to learn things such as simulations for specific photonic components, electronics, and things that you will not learn, well, actually might not learn in your undergrad. Like you might learn about astrophysics specifically or astronomy, but getting into a niche group and finding your own niche will allow you to actually open your eyes to a lot of other skills, possibilities, and also, mainly that. And in general, he wanted me to remind you to always stay curious when it comes to this kind of things. And with that, I'll hand it to Sapo. He'll present this part.
Very cool presentation. I definitely learned a lot about astronomy, instrumentation, dark matter research. Shift gears a little bit, and today we're going to talk about how physics has been applied in neuroscience, and we'll be drawing examples from whole brain modeling. Might not sound understandable to you right now, but I hope to make you excited of how physics can be applied in neuroscience. So to understand how we create a biophysical model of the brain, we have to end up talking about computational neuroscience. So computational neuroscience is a field that combines a bunch of disciplines, which includes neuroscience, mathematics, physics, computer science, and engineering. And we take the best out of each discipline to understand how the brain works. And we do this by creating mathematical models and computer simulations of neurons and neural networks. So, instead of focusing solely on the experimental biology, like studying neurons under a microscope, computational neuroscientists use equations and algorithms to describe how neurons behave, how neurons communicate, and how large network of neurons process information. So the field of computational neuroscience started as creating mathematical model that represent the behavior of individual neuron, which is the first image you can see at the top. And these models simulate how neurons generate electrical signals, and we call that action potential. And they also try to simulate how each neuron respond to inputs from other neurons. And the scientist Hodgkin Huxley was like the main pioneer of this work. But if you think our brain is not just about a single neuron, it's about how population of neurons interact with each other. So that's how they came up with something called neural mass model, which basically try to create a mathematical model that captures the dynamic interplay between excitatory neurons and inhibitory neurons. Excitatory neurons are, those neurons that excite other neurons or that increase the activity of other neurons. But on the other hand, inhibitory neurons are those neurons that inhibit or suppress the activity of other neurons. And they interact with each other to excite or inhibit each other. And so neuroscientists have come up with a way to mathematically model that interaction. But again, our brain is not just about population of neuron, isn't it? It's about kind of like the entire brain. And so a next generation of scientists came up with something called continuum neural field. And this is basically a mathematical model used to describe the activity of large population of neurons spread out across a continuous region, such as, the surface of the brain is technically a continuous region, or a continuous surface, isn't it? So instead of focusing on individual neurons, a continuum neural fields treats brain activity as a smooth and continuous wave of electrical signals. Much like how a fluid or wave can be described in terms of continuous quantities without needing to track every molecule in the fluid. So that's the idea of continuum neural field. However, the above three models that I've mentioned, there's a lot of limitations with it because it did not consider certain things. So for instance, the continuum neural field did not consider the structural connections between neurons, or how each of two neurons are structurally connected with each other. It did not consider that. The continuum neural field also did not consider how the activity of each brain area might correlate or synchronize with each other. The continuum neural field also did not consider, how our brains have different cell types and how, there are different kind of neurons distributed differently across the brain. And so that's where whole brain modeling comes in. So whole brain modeling creates a very, very realistic model of the entire brain, and it takes into account of both the structure and the function of the brain. And so today we will be focusing on the whole brain network or whole brain modeling. And I want to show an example of how the principles of physics have been applied to understand the whole brain dynamics. And there's a lot of complex terms here, like coupled oscillators, but I promise you, I would try and slowly scaffold what is going on. So let's look at this image here with the two Coke bottles. If you swing the Coke bottle on our right, this Coke bottle becomes like a pendulum, correct? And when this Coke bottle moves back and forth regularly, we call this process an oscillation. So this swinging Coke bottle is basically an oscillator. Okay, so anything that swings back and forth or has a certain rhythm, we call that an oscillation. So just keep that in mind. And actually, this swinging Coke bottle is very similar to our nerve cell, our neurons. But although nerve cell doesn't actually move like Coke bottle, our nerve cell is still an oscillator because it fires periodically. Let's say, the neuron might be firing, sending signal once every 10 milliseconds. And because this firing happens periodically, we could also call our neuron an oscillator as well. So neuron and Coke bottle is basically both of them are basically oscillators. So just a reminder, we have just now established that the Coke bottle on the right is an oscillator if we swing them and if it swings at a certain, rhythm. But let's say while this right Coke bottle is swinging, we also push the left bottle and it starts swinging as well. So what does that mean? This means that we have two oscillators or two Coke bottles swinging back and forth. But I mean, if you're following so far, I have a question for you, for the audience, is that if you look at these two Coke bottles in the image, do you think that the two Coke bottles are swinging independently? Or in other words, would swinging of one Coke bottle affect the swing rhythm of the other Coke bottle in this image? Like, does anyone want to give it a shot? I know it's a pretty difficult question, but let me put that in the chat. So let's say you're swinging one Coke bottle, and then you're also swinging the other one on the left. Yes, Laiba, that's correct. It will affect each other. Would they eventually synchronize? Yes, that is correct. So, great job. Really glad. So they are not independent of each other because they're actually connected by the string, you see? And because one oscillator affects the other because of this physical connection like the string, we say that these two oscillators are coupled to each other. So now you understand what coupling means, is when two oscillators are like affecting each other. To conclude, these two Coke bottles set up here are called coupled oscillator. But before that, I have another question. Do you think our brain or neurons act as a coupled oscillator as well? Yes or no? Yes, that's great. Would anyone want to give a stab why that's the case? So I'll give a hint. So our neurons, are they connected to each other? Yes or no? Yes. So because our neurons are structurally connected to each other, um, in some ways, one oscillator, like one neuron, will be affected by the other neuron. So technically, our brain or neuron actually act as coupled oscillators as well. At some point, these two Coke bottles that originally swung in different rhythms might end up swinging together. And so we can think of coupled oscillators like whether it will be a Coke bottle or like a brain, we can think in terms of two phases, which is synchrony and asynchrony. Synchrony simply means when the two Coke bottles are swinging together at the same rhythm, or it could also mean like two neurons firing together at the same time. So that's synchrony. And asynchrony simply means two Coke bottles just swing at random rhythms. So Kuramoto actually is a brilliant physicist, mathematician, and actually I think he mathematically modeled this synchronization of coupled oscillator. And as a neuroscientist, we actually use this parameter to indicate whether our brain system is at synchrony or not. And high parameter or high Kuramoto local order parameter simply means high synchrony. But actually Kuramoto did like the hard work of coming up with this number and modeling it. In the next slide, I want you to see that by being able to quantify the phases of synchrony of coupled oscillators, this will be very important for understanding the underlying dynamics of cognition and the brain. So this is the last slide I'm going to talk here about whole brain modeling. So let's say once we're able to identify phases of synchrony within our brain, we can model something called the turbulent-like dynamics within our brain. But to understand this, I want to give an example of an airplane first. So, when we experience turbulence in our flight, the airplane literally shakes. But let's understand why that's the case. And to illustrate that, I want you to think in terms of two things. One is synchrony, which we have just talked about, and another is in terms of energy distribution. Let's say in the beginning stages of turbulence, when the air or fluid is relatively stable, the molecule or the fluid elements are moving in a more synchronized manner. And you can say like the energy is distributed uniformly across the system. So in the beginning stages of turbulence or when there's no turbulence, there's pretty much high synchrony. But then when there's a disturbance, like unstable weather conditions, and when there's an addition in energy, the synchrony between molecules starts to break down. And basically, this introduces large eddies or swirls where regions of air within the airplane begin to move at different velocities or direction. And these large eddies can be seen as regions of partial synchrony, where air molecules or fluid elements are somewhat coordinated within region, but are no longer synchronized across the whole airflow or whole, swirl of air. And as these large swirls of air or eddies become more chaotic, the breakdown of synchrony kind of progresses from larger scales to smaller scale. And this breakdown transfers the kinetic energy from large partially synchronized region to smaller and smaller regions of the flow. And as the flow gets smaller, you get something called turbulence, which is basically chaotic, unpredictable flow of air happening everywhere around the airplane. But you don't really have to understand what I just said. So again, I want to emphasize that this breakdown of synchrony during turbulence happens very efficiently. And what does that mean? That means that the energy from the initial disturbance very quickly spreads across different scales of the flow. And this is why turbulence is such an excellent mechanism through which energy is transferred and distributed. So keep the fact that turbulence now facilitates efficient energy transfer in your mind, okay? So keep that. And now let's think about the brain. You know that our brain processes information like faster than the world's most advanced computer, and our brain's constantly adapting, rewiring. But how does it manage to stay efficient without ever burning out? So neuroscientists thought that turbulence could play a role in brain dynamics and could be important for ensuring efficient information transfer. And since, turbulence can be described as a changing level of synchronization, we can use Kuramoto's parameter for describing synchrony in coupled oscillator to quantify turbulence. Like, isn't that cool? I basically just scratched the surface of how you model turbulence, but this paper of modeling turbulent-like network in our brain was actually recently published in 2020. And of course, the field of whole brain modeling and using principle of physics continue to develop. I'll send a link to paper in the chat, but I'll go to the next slide, which will be the Libby's part again.
Hello, Celtic from here. Thank you, Stefan, for sharing that. That's actually really cool to see how you actually encountered physics in your field. And also especially This is really interesting considering the recent Nobel Prize in Physics that has just been won. I think it relates to this, so
Yeah.
that's actually a cool connection. But yeah, so now I'm gonna go over just really quick over a few recommended skills, so technical level skills for somebody who might be interested in going to research and maybe you want to get ready for it. But I just wanted to highlight the fact that in this set of skills, I'm not telling you you have to know all of them specifically by heart. No, this is more of like, it's important to diversify your set of skills as you advance in your career, not only high school, but also undergrad, and even as you keep going up. Now, the first thing that I think is not that mentioned a lot is knowing common instrumentation. So things such as a multimeter, an oscilloscope, and an Arduino, you can know what they are, but if you know the basics of how to operate them before you get into research or before you get into your lab course, for example, will give you a huge advantage when it comes to time, because you no longer have to sit down and see how each of this actually work. Second of all is coding. I know this probably has been mentioned, but it is really important to know the basics of how to program. So something such as Python, MATLAB, and Arduino. With Arduino, I mean the code that is used to control the microcontroller I just showed, so the one here. But with this, I'm not telling you have to learn, for example, how to do really complex interfaces and stuff like that, right? It is mainly really simple interfaces, like the one you see right here. Remember when I presented the electronic piece, I said it was electronically controlled, right? In order to do that, I created this simple interface, which all it does is switches something on and off and changes the value of our different chips. So basic stuff like that. Then something that I think will always be emphasized in this kind of talks is knowing how to read a paper. It's really important to know how to make out the most of time when it comes to reading a paper. And for that, I have here a few tips on how would it be the best way depending on how much time you have. So for example, let's say you're late to meet with your supervisor, you have just half an hour to skim through the paper. Well, in that case, if you're in that situation, I recommend go over the quick path, which is pretty much reading the abstract and going directly into the conclusion. This will give you a broad understanding of what's going on in the paper. Now, let's say you actually woke up a bit earlier, so you have a bit more time before you go to meet your supervisor. So you go over the general path, which you read the abstract and the conclusion, but you include the introduction, which would, of course, give you a general background on the concepts you're going to be reading on, and you go to the analysis, which will highlight the main results of the entire thing. And finally, if you actually have a lot of time, you can go over the entire thing. But I have left a bit of a region open here in the methodology because it's always important to highlight that if, for example, you're reading a paper that includes physics and biology, the methodology might include things in biology and you're a physicist and you might not care about the biology side of the methodology. For example, let's say microscopy. So let's say you're looking at a sample and you want to know the physics of how you actually create the image through microscopy. You're not going to be interested on how the biologists prepare the sample. That is going to be included through the methodology, but it is a part that you do not have to know by heart. You might find it interesting, but it's always good to know that when you're reading a paper to focus specifically on your field. With that said, we're going to go a bit more into a personal kind of note and shine a bit of light on what we think research actually is. And for that, I want to say that research work is actually very exciting, enriching, mostly flexible, because some experiments will require you to stay overnight, some of them you can do whenever you feel like, and very rewarding. But here's where the but comes, when things actually work for you, right? Now, the truth is that research work can also be very frustrating, time demanding, and challenging. And this is a reminder that things can and will go wrong when you do research, especially in experimental kind of work. Now, because of this, we wanted to give you a few tips and advice on what to do when things are not going your way. So it's important to learn how to take a break and reward yourself not only when you succeed, but also when you're having a hard time. So let's say you're having a hard time, nothing's working, go get yourself your favorite treat. Second of all, I think this is very cliche-ish, but you have to ask questions. No matter at what level you are, even if you're in your PhD and you think your question is basic physics, it's better to ask it than to not. Pretty much is the example here. Third, it's okay to make mistakes. They will occur. And the important thing in this, once again, as cliche-ish as it might sound, it's important to learn from our mistakes. I used to tell myself previously that if I accidentally burn a resistor, it's not going to be the end of the world. If anything, I learned how to connect it the proper way. Another thing that we thought is really important to mention is go to events. And this is not the go to events to take a breather or to relax. No, go to events like colloquiums, presentations, and all that. Because science, at the end of the day, it's a collaborative community. And by going to events, you might meet people who maybe you exchange contacts and will not hear from in years. But after so many years, you might find out they're doing research specifically in the area you want to collaborate with. So making connections is always a good idea. Lastly, apply to every opportunity you have, and I think this cannot be emphasized enough. You might think you're underqualified for a position. I specifically, when I was in my first year of undergrad, did not apply because I think I didn't have the actual experience, and later found out that many of the people who got into the position were first years who did not have necessarily experience, but had passion and the willingness to actually learn and make up for the fact that they lacked experience in that area. So those are the general things we wanted to highlight for anybody who's thinking into getting into research or might be curious about how things actually are. And well, with that said, I'll thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Libby, for the lovely presentation. And I think I can say that I've learned a lot about physics, especially like astronomy and dark matter. And also I've gained new perspective on how we think about research. So I will open up for questions for the audience. Feel free to type in the chat.
Hi, yeah, I was just thinking about if Libby could go over the chip that replaces all that bulky deformable mirror stuff back in the optics section.
So here it is, right?
Yes.
So you're curious to know how this actually works?
Yeah.
Okay, wait. I have one slide. Sorry, I'm gonna try to show the slide specifically if anybody had any questions. Wait. This slide was left in case anybody had any questions here. So this is a bit more of the complex parts of the chip. And in principle, what is happening is that when you shine light through the chip, here we have what is known as a microlens array. Light is going to get divided into some beamlets of light if you want to. And each beamlet is going to go through waveguides. So things just like structures that are going to guide our light into this part here, which I call the photonic deformable mirror, which are just a bunch of phase shifters. Now, what we're doing there is we're changing the optical path of our light through changing. I don't know if anybody's familiar with optics. We change what is known as the refractive index there, which just changes the speed at which our different beamlets travel. So pretty much we're dividing this distorted thing that you see here into little chunks, and we're correcting them such that they all come out at the same time as a flat wavefront here. So as a flat thing here. That's what actually happens here. So we use what's called phase shifters in order to actually correct for light, the distortions in light. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Yeah, I think there was a question in the chat actually asking, can you please suggest any online astronomy course for beginners?
Yes, so I actually asked O'Neill before the presentation that because I was sure somebody was going to ask that. And I'm not very knowledgeable in that area, but O'Neill suggested the MIT Open courseware. It's really useful. And in general, Coursera courses are good for astronomy. I also did a few before I actually started my undergrad just to prepare for a bid. So those are two free sources that are, I think, really useful if you want to get started.
Great. And I was gonna suggest Coursera, like, like Libby said, like if you're in first year and you want to get into your first experience, it's often like the professor would like to look for someone who's very passionate because these fields are very complex and I don't think anybody expects you to come in with like already know every skills on the table. And even us as PhD students, we don't have the necessary skills sometimes to complete the project. And that's why we are students, right? We are there to learn. But one way to like convey our passion is, for instance, do some Coursera and like try to really understand like the theory behind certain astronomy research, understand different fields. Another way I found is I try to read papers and summarize them. So things like, creating annotated bibliography. It's basically like a way to evaluate and summarize research papers. And yeah, these things are like often more harder than taking courses, but I think it's really worth it. Even if you don't understand the paper, but if you have made a reasonable attempt and actually maybe you tell a professor like, "Oh, I tried reading your paper," and the prof might be more inclined to take you in because they see that passion and drive within you. And of course, there's different ways of showing passion, but these are just the few ways I think. So Menna asked, do you have any good advice for fresh high school students passionate about electronics and astronomy and how to start their own ideas? It's a great question. Libby, any thoughts?
Yeah. That's actually a really great question. If I had discovered my passion for electronics beforehand, uh, I would have actually, I guess that, okay, once I asked the master students how she got really good when it came to soldering and creating circuits and all that, she told me a good tip was she went to the old computer shops and asked to buy the scrap pieces, so like those boards of electronics that nobody uses or that are a bit burned, and she would take them back home and try to do like circuit diagrams out of them. Just like see, okay, this is a resistor and everything, and solder things back on and off. See if she could fix them. So stuff like that, I think it's really fun if you can get yourself buying a little like soldering iron for yourself. They're actually not that expensive. You can have one at home and buying yourself little pieces of electronics to actually do. Um, I guess that in order to get ideas, it's always good to read papers in general. But not only that, maybe before, if you're passionate about something and want to learn a bit more, looking at the different websites of the labs you're interested, for example, is something really good. You can go and see what they're doing, and they usually have a lot of new things going on and the research is going on. And if you're passionate and really interested, send emails. Send emails to the profs. I would suggest that. That's something I would have done. I would have liked to know beforehand. You can get your research supervisor that way, or in general, just get a bit more insights. Some profs might be like, "Oh, we have this that's just going to be published. Do you want to read it?" Or be like, not specifically to get a position, but just if you're curious, if you ask them, believe me, they would be more than happy to tell you and talk about it. Yeah, I think that.
Yeah, professors love talking about their research. So
Yeah.
if you go to a prof saying, "Oh, I read this paper and I tried to create a smaller model of like the electronics using like stuff from my backyard," I think they'll be very impressed.
Yeah.
I have a question for you. You have, definitely been in several labs as your undergrad. What were one of the most challenging part of research for you?
Uh, I think that one of the most challenging parts is having to adapt to the unforeseen events. Real life, like research has real life problems. You make your perfect plan on how you're gonna do your research or like your how it's gonna be your project, and maybe the components don't arrive in time or things just do not work how you initially theorized they would work. And I think that is one of the hardest parts, knowing how to adapt. And in general, sometimes it's just in terms of, I think, resilience. Um, Sometimes things are out of your control, and having to understand that the manufacturer said that they were going to send it in 1 month, but they're actually going to take 3 months now, and you have to plan for those things. So I think that would be one of the hardest things, I think, to learn. It's something that cannot learn through books or through class. It's more through experience. So,
Yeah, that's
uh,
great. And I think for me, I would say it's very challenging, but actually a lot of times in research, you kind of have to do things on your own. At least, so just for context, I do a lot of computational stuff. So that means no one really like teach you how to program. You have to go look it up yourself, or like let's say you have your code and you want to analyze like certain neuroimaging data or certain forms of data. Like and I have trouble in my code. So for instance, if I use MATLAB or R or Python, it shows certain errors. And I'm like, oh, what is this error? Like, I don't know what to do. But what I think is very challenging is to try and use Google, use like tons of resources and like figure your way around and troubleshoot that code. And I think this not only applies to computational stuff, but to wet lab as well. Like when you face problems in like a biological experiment, sometimes you have to figure out yourself because you are the controller of your experiment. You are the one who would know best what might have gone wrong. But obviously, you should ask help. But remember, like in research, in some sense, the responsibility lies within you to sometime troubleshoot and get that work done. And I think that is what is quite difficult about research, but it's very fun as well because you get to do your own things. Okay.
Yeah. No, yeah, adding to that is kind of fun. You become an expert of like this own niche of yours, and you're like a really good expert at that specific niche, I think. But yeah, like nobody else can help you with that because you're the expert in that area.
Yeah, and I mean, I was just curious. So let's say if, like especially for high school students, I mean, we give advice like, oh, you have to read research papers, but how do you really go about tackling very complex, physics research papers? I think it's sometimes like a little barrier. Do you have any suggestions on like some practical tips of how they can really approach these papers?
Yeah, I think first thing to say would be do not get overwhelmed by the results section. Sometimes you see all these graphs that have a lot of points and dots and you all these things and all this variables stuff like that, and I think that can be very overwhelming at first. Also in the methodology section, like I said, some unless you want to recreate the actual experiment or like have like a really in-depth understanding of how things went, skipping the methodology is it's okay. It will not give you them. It will give you an insight, of course, but if you're starting to get into reading research papers, I would suggest skipping the methodology section and directly going into analysis or conclusion. Also skip the results. I would say, like I said, that can be a bit overwhelming. In general, reading a bit before, like the introduction might be a really good background understanding, but a lot of papers, at least I have experience, do not include some terminology. They will assume you're an expert in a few things, and that might be a bit confusing. So it's always good to do some background check on what you're reading. So maybe take a step back, and instead of trying to read the actual paper that's proposing a dark matter particle candidate, go sit back and see the first papers of what dark matter is, like explaining what dark matter is or how you detect it. So kind of maybe take a step back.
Yeah, that's very cool advice. And I think there are more ways actually that now that I was reflecting. So actually one way is you can read news articles that like scientific news articles that talk about like a certain topic of your
Yeah.
interest. And often they would cite the original paper and they have digested really well. And so that's one way to kind of be familiar with the field. Second, at least, I don't know in physics, but in biology at least, it's very common to for scientists to write reviews that are relatively understandable because they try to, you know, show you the recent development in their field, and often they want other people from other field to understand what they're doing as well. So actually reading review papers helps a lot. And thirdly, if you notice that you're like if you read the introduction and you find like you don't know so many things, sometimes actually it's just better to take a course like an online Coursera to at least have, basic uh like a strong foundation in like terminologies used in certain fields. Like in astronomy, you would want to know like certain terms. So that actually helps. And you should try to memorize them. So at least when you read paper, it flows a bit more smoothly. Oh yeah, Arushi said, so science people have something called science perspective, made for a broad audience and connect past research and the current field in brief. Yeah, that's very cool. So just to elaborate that further, so some journals, for every paper they publish, they have something called perspective. So what this perspective does is that it's like a shorter summary that tends to be more easily understandable. And like Arushi said, it's made for the broad audience. It's still very academic. Oh, if you follow profs on Twitter, formerly Twitter, now X, they tend to summarize their papers in a thread. Yes, that is correct. If you're interested in a prof's work, you should actually follow their Twitter because in the academic settings, we use Twitter to kind of digest a lot of preprints or like papers that are gonna be published. And yeah, Twitter is a very cool way to understand the research paper. Thank you, Arushi.
Yeah, that's something that reminded me, like the summary part. As I previously mentioned, going into the profs, for example, lab website, they usually there since they want to attract people into research, they sometimes have really good summaries on what they're doing and the perspectives of like what they do. So that is something really good to go into.
Cool. I guess if we have no questions, we're gonna wrap up. And thank you so much, everybody, for coming. I hope you guys learned something. Thank you, everyone. Okay,
Thank
bye-bye.
you so much. Well, bye-bye, everybody.